Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for coming back. I think other people will just sort of come in little bits. So I've been asked to do two things. Firstly, just to introduce the day and say a few words to introduce our plenary speaker. So, we're all focused on trying to generate more novel medicines. Increasingly, we're thinking about how we can make them more affordable. And of course, we need to try and produce them quickly. Let me just share a few metrics. Now, Sarah did an amazing job yesterday sharing some numbers around aging, but she didn't mention anything about specific diseases. So let me just share a few numbers. So in cancer, in the next 12 months in the UK, 350,000 people will get diagnosed with cancer. That's hard to imagine. It's 1,000 people every day. Today, 1,000 people across the UK will get diagnosed with cancer. Half of us in this room during our lifetime will have a diagnosis of cancer. Today in the UK, we've got 850,000 people with dementia. In 2050, that number is going to be 2.1 million. Imagine 2 cities the size of Birmingham with dementia. Most of us are going to live to more than 80. 1 in 6 of us will have dementia. We didn't talk about mental health yesterday, but the figures are across Europe, 83 million people have got some sort of mental health condition. 25% of individuals during their lifetime will have some sort of mental health episode. In the UK, out of 150 girls aged 15, 1 out of 150 will have anorexia. I mean, these are horrific numbers. We didn't talk about rare diseases really yesterday, but across the planet, there are 7,000 rare diseases. If you add up all those patients, that's 350 million patients. 30% of those kids don't reach the age of 5, and it takes anywhere between 6 and 8 years to get a diagnosis. But the tragedy is 95% of those individuals have absolutely no approved treatment. 95% have no treatment. We touched on AMR, and maybe Jeremy might touch on that as well. We're fortunate in this country that Sally Davis for the past 6, 7, 8 years has been highlighting what a challenge that is. Now, today, across the world, 700,000 people a year are dying because they're resistant to existing antibiotics. In 2050, that figure is going to be 10 million. We desperately need more novel drugs. We also need more affordable drugs. Now, the paper that was published 4 years ago, in 2015, focusing on cancer, and these are numbers in the UK. So what they did was they looked at, in the year 2000, in the UK, we had 69 drugs for cancer. Of those 69 drugs, 50 of them were cytotoxic agents. The average duration of treatment was 181 days. The average cost of that treatment was £3,000. And in the year 2000, that was equated to 20% of our GDP per capita. They did the same analysis in 2013, and now there was another 63 drugs for cancer. But the average duration of treatment had gone up to 263 days. So it's gone up from 181 to 263. But the average cost of that treatment was now £35,000. So it's gone up from 3,000 to 35,000. And 35,000 equated to 140% GDP per capita. So it's gone up from 20% to 140%. And that trend, frankly, is continuing. Last year, I think many of you who are aware, Spark Therapeutics launched a new gene therapy for a rare form of vision loss. The average cost of that treatment is $1 million per patient. So it's $500,000 for each injection into each eye. Now, that doesn't cure the vision loss. It makes it a little bit better. Now, even in the US, most people cannot afford that. I suspect in the UK hardly anybody can afford it, and in certain parts of the world nobody can afford it. We need more affordable treatment. And we need them quickly. When you talk to patients, even tomorrow is too late. Patients want the drug today. They want the treatment, the cure ASAP. Tomorrow is too late. What they don't want from us is excuses. What they don't want from us is us blaming each other. Oh, it's the fault of the regulators, or the commercial hurdles are too high, or whatever. They expect us to come up with solutions. So please, let's think about how we can better work together to come up with some of these solutions. And we touched on yesterday the importance of collaboration. And I absolutely believe that in the UK, we've got some amazing researchers, some incredible innovators, some great leaders, and some wonderful entrepreneurs. I also think in the UK, we've got some fantastic resources and infrastructure. UK Biobank, Genome England, Sanger, the universities, the NHS, the catapults, etc. These are amazing resources. Let's make use of them. We also have a great track record in this space. And I also think in the UK, we have a great culture of open science and collaboration. And I would, at this point, maybe just highlight two organizations who I think in the past 2 decades have really pushed this open science agenda in the UK and indeed across the world in this space. And those two organizations are the Wellcome Trust and GSK. I mean, certainly I think these organizations appreciate that what we're trying to do is so difficult, it's risky and it's expensive, and we need to come together and to focus on some of these big problems. So let's think about what we can do, what collaborations, partnerships we can create. So it's a real pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker. I'm so glad he accepted the invite to come. We all know Jeremy. Jeremy is an amazing scientist. He's a brilliant researcher. He's a very passionate innovator. And he's a very remarkable leader. He's a humble individual. He's a very generous leader. And frankly, I think we're lucky to have somebody like him representing science and medicine in various political discussions across the planet. And he's a great ambassador for us. So I'm delighted he's accepted this invite to come and talk to us. The problems we're talking about are things that I know he worries about 24/7. He worries about science in the UK, and he worries about generating more medicines for patients across the world. So, Jeremy, thank you very much. I'll pass over to you. If you could maybe, Jeremy, talk for about 20 minutes, and that will give us about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you.
So thanks very much indeed. It is one of the great pleasures to be introduced by Chaz. You never quite recognise the person he introduced you by, but Chaz, thank you very much, and it is great to join you. And the bit that was right about the introduction was this is something that on a personal level, obviously, I'm yes very interested in, but also the Wellcome is very interested in this space, and I think. Would be very keen to continue to be part of this knowledge exchange in ways that we perhaps haven't yet quite defined as you get started on this space. And sometimes Wellcome can play a critical role, sort of as a neutral. I don't really like the word convening because I think what we need is more leaders rather than conveners. But nevertheless, the ability to bring people together, I think, is something that we can contribute. And of course, we're lucky enough to have some resources. But what I think we all have to appreciate is the truth is none of us have the resources that are actually required. And you've heard some of the numbers, I'm sure you did yesterday. So I'm not the right person to talk about the actual R&D pipeline. There are many in the audience who are much better than that than me. What I wanted to do, just for maybe 15 minutes, is just perhaps step back and think as you're thinking how to set this, whatever you want to call it, knowledge exchange, initiative, program, whatever else. What I think we need to think about collectively in order to do that. And I think it's critical to, as Chaz did a little bit there, to not necessarily see the world as it is, but to see the world as it might become. And then to accept, whoever we are, in whichever organisations we are in, that those numbers that Chaz gave, that we all know, those are not inevitable. And one of the favourite phrases I learned from somebody else is we are not passive observers of history. And those numbers and the challenges that we face are not inevitable. And if you do the right things with the right partners and you address the right challenges, then I think you can change that course of where things go. And in order to do so, you have to go out there and stand and make the case for that. And I think you also have to appreciate, we have to appreciate, I should say, the collective, holistic approach to what is required. And I'll give some examples of where I think we got that right and where I think we got that wrong, in order to truly change the agenda. So taking a step back and taking a global perspective. So the demographic changes we are all very aware of. I think last week was the first time in history that there were more people over the age of 65 than under 65. First time in the history of humanity that has occurred. The GDP shifts. I think if you're thinking through how this knowledge exchange or initiative is going to play out, and you all know that the timescales it takes to develop new medicines if we continue in the current path, then we've got to look to where the world is going to be in 2030, 2040 and 2050. And that is going to change dramatically. Population is obviously going to change dramatically, but if you look at the G7 as a driver of a political and economic driver at the moment and look to 2040 and ask who's going to be the G7, it's going to be very different. In fact, there's probably only going to be one, potentially two countries that currently formulate the G7 in the G7 of 2050. And that geopolitical axis is shifting. And if the current G7 choose to respond to that by inward looking, as some countries seem to be doing at the moment, then that shift is going to occur quicker. And so I think we as a scientific and broad industrial community need to see where that's going and to be part of steering it, might be too strong a word, but appreciating that that is going to change. Also, I think healthcare delivery is going to change. If we look at the world of today, and particularly from a Western European and particularly from a UK perspective, and consider the concept of the NHS, whether in this country, but in most other parts of the world, that may or may not be the future of healthcare delivery. And I think as we start to think how we're going to A, prevent and B, treat conditions, we have to think what sort of system are they going to go into? And it comes back to my comment about the political and geopolitical changes that are going to go on, and how are those countries going to construct a healthcare delivery system? Is it going to be a Western European model, or is it going to be a US model at one extreme, or is it going to be something in between? And the reality is probably something in between. But in the end, those systems, whether we call them national systems or we call them insurance systems or some sort of hybrid of the two, they are ultimately going to be, at least in part, the purchasers of the new medicines that come along. The public is also going to change. You know, if you think of the way those of you with children, the way your children see the world today and how they interact with the world is completely different. And that patient, public health, clinician, nurse interface is changing. And Chaz mentioned a little bit, patients are going to be different. It's not going to be acceptable to say you can have and you cannot. And the growing inequalities in the world between those that have and those do not are less defined now potentially by nation states than they are within nation states. And the inequalities within countries are as stark as they are between countries now. And that will drive, with a more connected world, that will drive a sense of inequality. And equity has to be at least at the heart of what we're describing if we're going to do the right things for the maximum number of people. The spectrum of diseases is clearly changing as well, and the old concept of infectious diseases, mostly acute, with health systems that are defined in my previous life in Vietnam by acute infectious diseases is clearly changing. Both many of the infectious diseases are becoming chronic, and it doesn't matter whether you're in London or Washington or Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta or Lagos, you are now in all parts of the world, you have the double whammy in the health system of both the continued infectious disease burden and the coming of the non-communicable disease burden. And many, many healthcare systems around the world are not structured to deal with both of those at the same time. That will have a profound impact on the way countries try to address their health challenges. So if you look forward to 2040, 2050, the G7, as at least as defined by GDP, if not GDP per capita, will be China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, Turkey, Brazil, potentially still the United States. That will look a very different world. And that will have political and economic consequences, but it will also have consequences for where science is done. It will also have consequences for the sharing of information, and it will also have consequences for things like, including regulation, and how things go through pathways. And again, I think if we're thinking long term, then we have to consider how we're going to put these things in place in order to be part of that new world rather than the current world. And I believe very strongly we have to do those in parallel rather than in sequence. And I'll come back to an example of where I think we got that wrong. We're also going through a period, we've had a period, I think, in my lifetime and a bit longer, I might say up to, I'm the youngest of 6 children, so my eldest brother is a child of the 1940s. That generation has been through a period, although we perhaps didn't realise it, of relative stability in all sorts of ways. That is going to change, and we're going through a period of profound political and economic change, and the challenges of, yes, drug resistance, emerging infections, changing ecology, and critically climate change is going to change everything, along with diet and the way societies operate and the increasing urbanisation. If you look at something I've been very involved in over the last year or two, 3 or 4 years, Ebola in 2014-15 was not driven by a change in the virus or a change in the host genetics or a change in the immunology. It was purely driven by urbanisation and change of so societies work together. And I think this will become a critical part of all healthcare and also innovation that provides new solutions. And yet, at that time of real discombobulation, which I think a certain generation of which I'm part feels particularly profound because we've gone through a period of relative stability. But in that, we are actually at this remarkable, I would call it almost a scientific enlightenment, when we have invested around the world, in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and increasingly in China. We've invested in fundamental discovery science, which is now starting to come through. And every generation thinks they're in an enlightened scientific age, probably, but I do believe that we are in that age today. And if I just think in my lifetime, my professional career, what has happened, we took HIV from being, when I was a junior house doctor here in London, from a death sentence to a manageable, difficult but manageable long-term condition. The possibilities of immunotherapy have come into cancer now in an unbelievable way, actually. So, you know, the cancer will continue to be a fear, but actually we can and are in the process of transforming that with the appliance of science and bringing that to patient benefit, along with prevention. I mean, I don't suppose even GSK that were here thought their shingles vaccine was necessarily going to be what it is, and it has proved to be. That's a remarkable achievement. And I believe we'll come out of immunotherapies, and during the professional lives of some people in this room, if not my own, we'll be moving into an era of preventative cancer with either cancer vaccines more broadly, even beyond those which are driven by infection. So science, gene therapies, technological advances, the future, the coming of technological advances through the internet and others. And increasingly, and you know this better than I do, 70 to 80 or whatever percentage is of new biologics as opposed to small molecules. And that raises enormous opportunities in terms of the technology and the platform technologies which may drive it. It also raises an equity issue in the costs of goods of those biologics and how we're going to make those widely available to the world, and where that manufacturing is going to take place and where that tech transfer, and how do we deal with IP. These are all issues that I think we're going to have to challenge with. And as that demographic shifts, and we're starting to see, potentially with the shingles vaccine, this shifting already. And if cancer vaccines really do take off, I think that will change as well. With that demographic shift, we're no longer seeing, for instance, vaccination as being something that is for children. It is going to be an all-life vaccination, and that is also going to change with the changing demographic. So where do we get some things right and where did we get some things wrong? And why I think it's so critical to see this as an issue in parallel rather than in sequence. I was very involved in the late 1990s and early part of this century with the development of the artemisinin combination therapies. This was a Chinese herbal drug 2,000 years ago, came out of China traditional medicine for treating hemorrhoids and fever, and lo and behold, it's the most important antimalarial drug ever discovered. The evidence for that, done in a naive, dare I say it, academic way, was to think that if one provided the evidence of its efficacy and its safety, and actually it was also affordable, that the world would suddenly open its doors and this would be rolled out across the world. And in reality, from time of evidence to rolling out to impacting on people's lives was somewhere between 10 and 14 years. Approximately, probably, up to 2 million people died because of that delay. The issue is taking things forward not just at a scientific level, but appreciating that it has to come with a social science, with a regulation, with a political will. And these things, if they're done in sequence, will only delay. Now, industry knows this much better than academia, but I think philanthropy, funders, government, academia and industry have got to work, and regulators, got to work together so that these things can be done in parallel rather than in sequence, because if we do them in sequence, we won't meet the criteria that Chaz said at the start, which is patients want things quickly. Where we did things well, and it in some ways was a little bit easier, but that's not to take any credit away from the people, including at Wellcome, that were involved in this long before I was there, was around mitochondrial donation, where a very brilliant clinical scientist in Newcastle, Doug Turnbull, drove that scientific agenda, realised its clinical potential, and then I think Wellcome did play a critical role in ensuring that it wasn't just an academic, scientific and or industrial advance, but that it also built in a critical acceptance by society, a critical pathway to regulation, and actually requiring a change of legislation in this country. And those things were done in parallel. And as a result, in fact, in 2019, the first baby will be born, I suspect, in this country, having had the benefits of mitochondrial donation and stopping mitochondrial disease. The lessons for me is, one, my world, artesunate, we did it in sequence, and it took more than 10 to 15 years to come to fruition. And another one where somebody said we can do this in parallel, and we got there both very much quicker, and as a result, actually more affordably. We're currently working on tranexamic acid. This is a treatment for postpartum hemorrhage, reduces maternal mortality by 30-35% or so around the world. And as you all know, postpartum hemorrhage is perhaps the commonest cause of maternal death in childbirth. To get this through, it's a treatment which is incredibly cheap, it's safe and effective, but to get that through into mostly low and middle income countries with perhaps sometimes not the most sophisticated regulatory and policy pathway to allow it to happen, as well as distribution networks, is incredibly difficult, despite the fact that it's incredibly effective, very safe, and saves 30 to 35% of lives. So the point of those is, unless we appreciate that pathway, just having the R&D and just having the thing in a box called a treatment won't be enough. And we've got to put that in the context of that changing world geopolitically. Ebola vaccine was another good example of where I think we also need to collectively think about how we can address this. The time scale to normal, as you know very well, is whatever it is, 5 to 20 years. And in the context of an emergency, it was possible to do something on a timescale which was, at the time, unprecedented, which was to demonstrate you could move from almost first-in-man studies in the United States and Canada through to a demonstration of efficacy for a vaccine in the course of about 2 years. I learned two lessons from that. One is that when there is an emergency, and it's very interesting to decide who defines an emergency in the currents of the last week or so, but when there is an emergency, you can do things in a different way without necessarily giving up on any safety, standard of study, or ultimately regulation and approvals. And so it is possible to do it. And the other, and this is for people working in vaccinology around, because I do think vaccines should be part of affordable medicines, is the demonstration that I think that community has become overly pessimistic in terms of new innovation and R&D. We've been used to working around vaccines around incredibly complicated, and this is true of medicines as well, very complicated things which we think are, and they actually may be impossible. An HIV vaccine, for instance, tuberculosis or malaria, incredibly difficult. There are a very large number of things out there in the infectious disease world, but infectious diseases into multimorbidity and cancer, where I think we need to be more optimistic about what can be done. And one of the lessons I learned from the Ebola vaccine, actually, I'm not saying it was trivial, but it was actually relatively easy to demonstrate that you could produce a vaccine against a disease like Ebola. And of course, in the current outbreak, over 100,000 people have received that vaccine, and it's proved to be incredibly effective. I think we do have to look at, we mentioned AMR, and a pipeline for the future where we may want to use things, and drug resistance is obviously one of the major issues here, with many of the pharma industry moving out of that space. We all know that, and we all know it's for good commercial reasons. It's very difficult at the moment to see any commercial market for the future development of antimicrobial agents and antibiotics. And unless we fix that, I think this is almost a template for where we may be going in terms of commercial returns beyond that sector. Because at the moment there is not a commercial driver for the development of new antibiotics, and in part at least that is because we've argued that things have to be cheap and cheerful at the start. And although I come from a sort of low middle income country, Korea, and a more developmental background perhaps than some of the audience, nevertheless I think what we need is good things, and then the world in parallel needs to work how we make them accessible and affordable to the world, rather than thinking we need cheap things. And if we start the conversation around we need this to be all cheap, then we will fall into the problem that infectious diseases had, which is nobody develops anything. And I would caution against, affordability and accessibility are crucial, and they should be at the heart of this debate. But if we start out by saying everything has to be cheap and affordable, then I doubt if we're going to have the innovation. And infectious diseases has gone down that hole, I think, to its detriment. So ultimately, I think we do need to rethink, actually, and the industry would be interested in your views on this, actually rethink the commercial structure of these entities, for which ultimately are public goods. These are ultimately public goods, but the truth is philanthropy and even governments coming together at the moment do not have the capacity to drive this. Wellcome, Gates Together, any other foundations you wanted to think about, even if we pooled all the resources in one entity, we still do not have the resources to drive this through at scale. The numbers are staggering, and again, I know I'm less knowledgeable about this than many in the room, but the current from Deloitte of last year, $2.18 billion to produce a new medicine. From 2010, that has grown from 1.2 billion. Now, you can debate those numbers, but they're ballpark figure, they're going to be right. And even if they're not exactly right, the trend is the same. And so that trend is not going to go away. And importantly, in the 12 major pharmas in that report, which I'm sure you've all read, their return on capital investment has dropped from 10.1% return on capital in 2010 to 1.9 in 2018. Now, that is not sustainable. That is not sustainable. And so unless we step back and look at this holistically and address these issues, that is not sustainable in the long run. And I don't think we're passive in how we do this. I think we've got to, it's not to blame the regulators. In fact, I would argue, and learning lessons going through Ebola, I would argue actually the regulators are really ready for conversations about how to improve the pathway. And they have to be part of this discussion. And although we traditionally, and quite rightly, think of the FDA, EMA and the Japanese, we've increasingly got to think of that geopolitical shift and where those regulators will be in the future. We have to rethink the pull and push mechanisms, I think, and obviously drug resistance is driving some of this thinking, but I think it has to be broader than that. The Global Fund and Gavi are both great for what they do, but the truth is they are now struggling as they come through with graduation from those countries. But nevertheless, as a 15-year model of how you can put in place pull mechanisms, whether they be through advanced purchase commitments, vouchers, or whatever else, I think we have to come back to look at that. And that essentially provides the incentives on which things can be driven. And appreciate as well that changing market. Indonesia is going to be one of those G7 countries with a population of close to 300 million people in 20 or 30 years' time. Nigeria, Mexico, Brazil. These are going to be the big markets of the future. And how do we make sure that G7 and increasingly G20 and the G7 of the future are embraced in this? And this is not just a conversation that goes on in London, Washington, Geneva, Paris, etc., but it embraces a wider group of stakeholders in what we're doing. I think we have to look at the costs of R&D. Now, the openness that Chaz talked about, I think, is critical to that in the pre-competitive space. We have to look at the costs of R&D. And if you look at the cost of where R&D happens, of course, there is the early phase development and the preclinical and the rest of it. But we have to look at our ability to conduct clinical trials at a cost that is affordable and a mechanism which actually gets at the root causes of what you want from a clinical trial, rather than actually what we've come to in ICH GCP to put in place, which is driving so much of the cost of taking something from a concept into a development phase. And this is something that we are working very actively with the EMA and the FDA and the Gates Foundation to try and see if we can create a different model, a different pathway that is respected and aligned with ICH GCP, but does things and makes use of data in a way that would, we hope, both reduce costs but not reduce any sense of working towards efficacy. Because I think we've put in place something that was appropriate potentially when returns were at the 10 to 15% mark. But if we can't drive those costs of clinical trials down somehow without losing the quality of them, then these become actually unaffordable. And beyond infectious diseases, we'll be in the same place as we are with drug resistance, where there are no new innovations and there's no new drugs coming along the line. So disruption is not about saying that the pharma in the room are not going to be the critical drivers of this. I do believe very strongly that they are going to be the owners of this, and they need to be embraced with it, not just the big, but the second tier of pharma. But unless we collectively come together and speak with one voice, and this is where I think organisations, academia and philanthropy can play a critical role, because like it or not, the voice of pharma within the governmental complex is what it is. And that's not what's necessarily needed, and its voice to the public. So I think unless we bring other brokers into this, including the academic sector, including philanthropy and others, then I don't think we can address it by just expecting the industry itself to drive this change. What we don't want to do is separate into a fragmented set of communities that are polarized in their debate, try to be simplistic about the solutions, and pretend that those solutions are actually going to drive the development of new medicines for the maximum number of people around the world. So I say all of that, and it may or may not have come across as pessimistic. I'm actually not pessimistic. I would be pessimistic if this sort of debate was not starting. I would be pessimistic if people were saying, actually, the model works and it's going to work in 2030, 2040 and 2050. But I do not think that is what is being said. I think the start of it has to be the first acknowledgement of what the issue is, and then the question of who needs to be part of that debate going forward, and what role can we all play, because the truth is none of us are at the scale that is required to actually change this on our own. But if there is something of a movement which absolutely has to bring the public with us, because otherwise the public will react against this and their politicians will react against this in a populist era. Unless we do this and build a coalition of people that are willing to push this forward, then I think we will see the history that Chaz articulated at the start, rather than the future of what I think is possible. Thank you very much.
Jeremy, that was awesome. Thank you.
I've got a question about costs and about the resources we've already got, because pharma has an enormous number of back catalogue drugs that have gone up to, say, stage 2 and then didn't show any efficacy better than current treatments. What about repurposing a lot of these drugs? What about retesting them, putting them back on the market? And a particular case in point is Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, where within 4 years of discovering the causative gene, they were into clinical trials in children that showed efficacy with repurposing. So there's a massive resource out there. We don't need to spend 2.1 billion developing a brand new drug. We need to look at what we've already got and see whether they work for different indications.
So I do agree with you. Artesunate was a treatment for hemorrhoids, and that didn't prove so successful commercially, and so it went into malaria 2,000 years later. I would just caution about saying there's a single answer. I think we all do believe and that there are things on shelves that for whatever reasons were not taken forward, often not for scientific reasons, but for other reasons. I think working through those, and this is why I think a coalition of like-minded organisations has to come together. What are people willing to acknowledge they have, both in academia, and academia can be as closed as industry, or more so. What are people willing to say, we have got this? How can we put that into a initiative, coalition, or whatever it is to repurpose? And obviously the structural genomics and is part of that. But I would just caution about saying it's all simple and it can be done by a single thing. I think what we need is to take a step back and put together the whole package and then get people to drive certain elements of it, of which repurposing, I think, is undoubtedly one. Yes.
Thank you.
Lee?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lee, CEO of Action Against AMD, a charity. So my question to you, Jeremy, is that yesterday we had a good debate on the role of many different actors. And in your talk, you mentioned the traditional ones. We have the pharma, we have the academia, we have the government. But more and more, we do see civil organizations taking up the challenge on their own, which I think is very laudable. And also, I don't think that we have started the discussion very strongly with the final stakeholders, which are the patients, or even future patients, right? So I was wondering, what's your opinion about how we can get these other sectors to start working with the traditional players, and whether the roles that we have nowadays should be perhaps reshuffled in order to start to create this new health delivery and all the structure of healthcare?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I'm sorry if I didn't mean to give the impression of if this is not an open box. I mean, just go back 20 years to all of your own, those of you who are over the age of 20. Go back 20 years and just look how the industrial world has changed and how disruption has led to industries that were unimaginable 20 years ago. But also how some have remained and undoubtedly a part of the solution. And I think that's personally where I am, that new actors and new players coming into it are critical. New ways of using information is critical, but I suspect that the current players will continue to be involved and should be open to new elements coming in. The link to patients, I think, is absolutely critical. And I would argue that in this era of whatever you want to call the populist agenda, those sort of conservative members, which we're all part of, have missed an opportunity to lead some of that debate, and therefore that vacuum's been filled. So linking to patient groups, this is easier in some. I think in the rare diseases it's easier. In cancer it's easier. In infectious disease it's difficult because those tend not to have a voice other than HIV. But just look at HIV and the power that patient communities and their families brought to that, and see the power of that. And they weren't talking about developing cheap things. We missed a trick because we took so long to get to sub-Saharan Africa with HIV drugs, but nevertheless, that was a remarkable achievement, driven by science, but it was driven by the patient voice behind it, and that is absolutely critical. And the more that can be involved, and that's obviously something very much at the heart of Wellcome, then I think the more powerful this argument will be.
Hi, thank you for that illuminating talk. Stephen Zimmer, Epicombi Therapeutics and Structural Genomics. I just wanted to make a couple comments. First of all, I think when you think about the numbers that you mentioned, the 3 billion, or just under 3 billion for costs of drug discovery and development, you have to put that in the context of a 95% or 98% failure rate. Okay, and so one has to look also, I think, going back, and this is something we'll talk about in our panel today, at the paradigm which is being used for discovering drugs, okay, itself. And that's been an unmovable object in many ways. People are not willing to reevaluate that. I think even in your own organization, when you evaluate projects, they're evaluated from a point of view of a particular paradigm, okay? And I think that's one of the debates we really need to have. The second thing I wanted to say is, in order to get to an affordable medicines situation, you have to there's one stakeholder that really needs to be brought into this debate, and that is shareholders of companies. Because pharma companies are obviously being driven by the need to have certain returns and certain dividends and things to their shareholders. And if they're not brought in and are willing to agree to a change in the model or a shift in the model so that affordable medicines are possible, it will not be possible because the pharma companies will not be able to change it. I mean, broadly, I agree with both of your comments. I mean, on the first, it's call it a paradigm shift in the way things are done. I think that is what is needed. And whether that's design of R&D, it's the openness, it's the going back and looking at things on shelves, it is the trying to reduce costs of clinical trials, it's improving decision. It's all of those things, because whether it's 2 billion or 1.5 billion or 3 billion,
including the 95% or 99% failures, doesn't really matter. That is an unaffordable sum. That's the bottom line. I think on the shareholder issue, I would be without some shareholders are there to maximize the returns to the company. And whilst we and you and others talk about companies' responsibilities to society, their license to operate, nevertheless, you can't expect companies, they're structured in a way which doesn't allow them to fail to produce a commercial return. When you talk about paradigm shifts, we have to think about that paradigm shift as well. And I don't think we can expect shareholders on their own to invest in companies that are going to say, well, you could get X return here, but we want you to invest here out of some sort of charitable approach without offering some sort of different commercial return.
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think it's a question. I think it's a question of resetting the whole thing. So
I agree.
It's looking at the whole picture, not just, well, we're going to reduce returns to shareholders.
Agree.
It's the front end of
Agree.
it. It also has to change, and it's a whole continuum.
Yeah. I mean, what?
Malcolm.
So Malcolm Skengle from GSK. A couple of things. So there's quite a bit of buzz at the moment about artificial intelligence and machine learning changing the paradigm. Just wondered about your thoughts on that. And the other thing, unrelated, if I may, I mean, you spoke of social scientists and what they've got to contribute in the space to change public opinion, get politicians on board, to change the Daily Mail headlines. I wholeheartedly agree. Where would you start with that one? So two things there.
Yeah, so again, I'm not an expert in AI, but like every new technology that comes in, it'll go through a phase of what's his irrational exuberance about what it's going to contribute. Whoever said that? Then probably, as with most technology, an era saying it's the answer to everything. Then a fallow period when perhaps it's proved to be a little bit more difficult than you think, and then sometime later, perhaps a real appreciation of what it can contribute. I suspect we're somewhere on that journey at the moment, probably, I might argue, in a bit of the irrational exuberance era. But you have to go through that to get through the other side. So I'm not against, of course. And I think it will throw up things that hypothesis-driven stuff does not do. I think on the whatever social scientists mean, but just an appreciation that none of us, including in this industry, exist in isolation outside the critical need to engage with the public, and they are the strongest advocates of change, because as Chaz said, there is an impatience to get the medicines that they, their children or their parents want. And I think at the moment, the public do not understand the mechanisms of drug development. They don't understand the pricing. They therefore talk to their politicians about we just need, this has to be affordable for everybody. And I think unless we break that cycle, then you're going to see a continued pressure from politicians to just push down. And in the end, that will destroy innovation, as we've discovered in infectious diseases. So I think engaging, this is something actually where I do think Wellcome can play a very constructive role, because the reason I came back to Wellcome, because it did three things. It did, whether badly is for you to judge, but it did a bit of science, did a bit of innovation, but critically it realized that you can't do those two things without engaging society. And without those three things coming together, I don't think you can change this paradigm. And by society, I mean politicians, I mean policymakers, I mean the regulators, the public, perception, and yes, even including, as I do every day, reading the Daily Mail.
Fantastic. One last question, Adam.
So, Jeremy, Adam Stoughton from Oxford University Innovation. I guess building on Malcolm's point, I mean, we've seen through, I guess, the malign power of the internet, the rise of anti-vaccination propaganda, and we're seeing its effects arguably in measles rates and others. How does this form part of Wellcome's strategy in that form of education and dealing with this very new medium, which is obviously global in its influence?
Yeah, I think it a little bit goes back to what I said earlier. I think we have, there's a certain generation of us who came through that 60 or 70 years of relative stability and just assumed it was going to be like that. And of course, history doesn't work like that. And we've moved away, and we've allowed a vacuum to be created. We had stopped talking about the power of things like vaccination or having decent health systems or services. We just assumed that the world bought into those concepts. We just assumed that there would be a pipeline of innovation coming through which would keep people well and healthy, and that for those of us in this room and beyond, that was an obvious thing for societies to do. And I think what the rise of some people from around the world in so-called populist agenda has just been to move into a vacuum to say, actually, we can challenge that because nobody else is, and by doing so, we can create a platform for ourselves to make other broader points. I think we have to go back and re-engage in it aggressively. I don't think we can stand on the sidelines and allow that vacuum to be created. And now turning that wheel backwards, like all preventative things, is really difficult. We've got to get better, which is why I framed the talk around thinking, what is the world going to look like rather than what it is today? And be more prepared for things that we may not predict. We can't predict the future, but we can at least have an idea of where we're going. On the anti-vaccine movement, I suspect it will swing back because I think, fortunately, in some ways, this has happened around measles. In some ways, I say that very cautiously. But I think you can immediately see the impact of this very, very viscerally with the spread of measles that's happened 3 or 4 times the average norm.
Jeremy, that was a truly visionary talk. Thank you. I mean, a lot of nuggets for me were sort of, I hadn't really thought about the changes in the G7 and the greater and greater need for equity and maybe a greater push on vaccines. But I thought what was particularly interesting for me was Jeremy's comment that don't start the discussion talking about cheap medicines or affordable medicines. Just come up with a good solution, and in parallel, we'll work out the models, etc. Jeremy, I don't say this lightly, but I absolutely believe the world needs more leaders like Jeremy. So thank you very much.